Well, good morning, everyone. The last time I spoke to you, it was called Nowhere Man, and it was based really on Ecclesiastes 1. And we were looking at what life was like without God. And we're examining, through this passage, man's search for meaning in life without God, a chasing after the wind. A few years ago, there was a film called Alfie, and we've listened to the words of that this morning. Now, I don't know how many of you ever saw that film. I remember as a lad seeing it. And the story was that this young man, he was a hedonist. He wanted to find out what life was all about. And he was searching for life. And he was looking for it in some sort of pleasurable way. And gradually, over the film, his life gradually crumbles and falters and fails. And the film ends with him walking along the London embankment, almost in despair. And that's when Cilla Black sings the song, "What's it all about, Alfie?" All the pleasure, all the things he was seeking seemed to be absolutely meaninglessness. And today we're going to look about what's it all about. And this is man's search for meaning in a meaningless world. There was a great artist, scientist, mathematician who was born in 1475. You know who that is, don't you? That was terrible. I should have said that. It was Michelangelo. And Michelangelo was a brilliant man. And he was asked once to paint the soul of man. He was asked to paint the soul of man. And he found it impossible. So in the end, what he did, he did a sculpture of David. And if any of you have been to the Victoria and Albert Museum, or you've seen the actual statue itself, you'll see this magnificent marble statue of David, who he regarded as the greatest man that ever lived. But as you look at this statue that Michelangelo made, he ignores God, because he builds David out of the rock, and he comes from the rock, and he makes himself better as he develops without God. That's how he saw it. That's how man sees it today. Man is on a search for meaning, but rather than starting with God, he starts with himself. And that's what we're going to be looking at during this time. And the Koheleth, the teacher, says that this man wants to find meaning. He's already said that there's a nowhere man. Life is meaninglessness. So how do I find meaning? And so his search begins. And the first thing he thinks, well, if I want to get meaning out of life, what I should do is to seek education. And in the latter part of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, he says that he went to seek education. He explores the great thinkers of his day. He starts to get and absorb all the knowledge he possibly can get. If today he would be going to Oxford or Cambridge, he would be gaining all the wisdom he has, because he thinks, if I am educated, if I start to learn these things, if they're in my mind, then surely this is meaning. This is what it's all about. This is what life is all about. So he studies, he studies, he studies. He thinks, he thinks, he thinks. And at the end of his thinking, he comes to a conclusion. He says these words: "With so much wisdom comes so much sorrow. What is the point of being wise? For the fool and the wise will die together." And later on in the book, he says this. He said, in fact, the wise man is at a disadvantage. And this is why. You look at today, we're stuck with wars in Ukraine and Russia. We see some terrible things happening. And the wise man looks at this and he tries to figure it out. Why are we going through so many problems in this world? Why is there so much trouble? And the wise man will absorb it, but cannot find an answer. Yet the fool can sit there and say, "Oh, there's a war Ukraine. Oh, let's go out and have a beer, shall we? And that's how the world sees it. And so the quote that this man says, what's the point of all the wisdom? Because the fool is the same as me. So wisdom isn't going to get anything. It's not wrong to get education. It's not wrong at all. But when you get education without God, it actually leaves a void in your life that's very, very difficult, in fact, impossible to fill. So he takes the next stage. And if he says, if wisdom isn't going to do something, I better turn my attention to pleasure. If ever we lived in a day of pleasure, it's today. Already we see adverts on television encouraging us to go away on holiday. We need 3 or 4 holidays a year. Get some pleasure out of going here. Get some pleasure out of enjoying this. And we go on the pleasure cruises. We go these things and that things and everything else. And in the end, when you've had all your pleasure, is there any contentment in that? Does man find contentment in pleasure? And the Koheleth concludes this. He said, I can go through all the pleasure I want. I can chase what is going to make me happy, what's going to make me live, what's going to give me contentment. And in the end, I say, it's a chasing after the wind. It's meaninglessness. And you can imagine a chasing after wind. You know, autumn comes and we have a windy day. You try to catch some leaves, you're chasing the wind and you never really get there. And that's what pleasure does. The more you seek pleasure, the more you want pleasure. And the more you want pleasure, the more you seek pleasure. And in the end you think, what is the point of this? So he gives up. Pleasure doesn't work. So if pleasure doesn't work, where do I go from there? And again, I turn to the things of the world. Again, I turn to what's happening in our present age. And he seeks meaning out of escapism. In chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, he talks about the things that he's going to do. He says this, I tried cheering myself with wine. I tried cheering myself with folly. My mind's still trying to guide me, but I just want to escape these things. That's what's happening again today. So many people think the answer is to be happy all the time and to do things that are just going to raise our spirits. For many years, and I'm talking about many years, I've worked with people who have problems with drugs and with alcoholism. I started that work in 1966 on the London embankment at midnight. And for all my years, I've seen that being an element of people's seeking after some sort of meaning. And when they can't find meaning, they want to blank it off. So you see a young person brought up in a good home, and suddenly he's smoking a bit of weed. And then it turns to a little bit of cocaine. Then it turns to a little bit of heroin. And before long, he's hooked on it. Does it give an answer? It does not. I've sat with hundreds, literally hundreds of young people who are hooked on drugs. And it hasn't brought them happiness, it has for the time, but in the end, they are empty. And so it is when you seek after that sort of escapism. And some people go beyond that. They say, well, if alcohol and drugs and that sort of thing doesn't work, what about entertainment? And they seek after entertainment. They become groupies. Do you know what a groupie is? It tells you your age if you know. But it's people that follow a certain pop group, or not, they don't call themselves pop groups nowadays, but they follow a certain thing, and they seek after that sort of music because all the time they're in the field of that music. It takes away the problems of this day. But when the music stops and the dance finishes, there is an emptiness. And then he says, well, all right, my escapism, I better look towards building myself mansions on this earth. So there he does. He builds mansions. He gets slaves. He gets those things that are going to make his life really content. He builds them all up and he looks around and he says, this is wonderful. This is one. Is it? Is it? I'm heading towards death. I'm going to die one day. And a fool could take this on. And so escapism was no answer to what's it all about. Building your mansions on earth doesn't bring pleasure. Building your developments on earth doesn't bring pleasure. I have an allotment. I have a lot of pleasure on the allotment, but that's not the end of the allotment. That's not the end of pleasure. There is something missing. There's an element missing. And then he says, right, if that doesn't work, and I'm really rushing through it this morning because I want to get this message home. He seeks meaning through activism, selfishness, and hedonism. Building your empire on earth without God. Building your empire on earth without God. That's when he turns his mind to great projects that he could involve himself in. And you know what people are like? They become entrepreneurs. They want to do something that's going to be meaningful. I don't know how many of you ever watch The Apprentice. Do you watch The Apprentice? I'm fascinated by it. You get these young people who are wanting to earn £250,000 to start their business. Yet as you listen to them, they are selfish, they are arrogant, they just want to get what they're getting and step on anybody that's in their way. And some people are like that today. And perhaps they get pleasure out of that. But in the end, that seeking pleasure through hedonism, through selfishness, through activism, means nothing at all. Building your whole world on this earth without God. You say, well, that's the Old Testament. That's what the Old Testament says. Let me tell you that strain was picked up by Jesus. When someone says to him, my brother's living and we've got an inheritance, will you tell him to divide his inheritance with me? Most important thing in his life. And Jesus told the parable. And he said there was a rich man who had all these mansions, everything going for him. He had built an empire to himself. And he said, now I can sit back and I can eat, I can drink, I can be merry. Jesus looked at him and said, you fool. You fool. This night your soul will be required of you. And what's the point of building a meaningless life on this earth and ignoring God? If ever there is a message for this age, it's this. And dear friends, I always say this, and those of you who watch the video, you may be building a life that you think is building for the future, but in the end, you're building a time when you're going to meet with God. And what is the point of all that you do here without having your peace with God? In our next video, in our next meeting, we're going to be looking at time. The subject's going to be the fool on the hill. The fool on the hill. If this Kohelet said man seeks wisdom and tries all these things and still sees it a chasing after the wind, we'll now turn to the fool's view of life and what happens in that life. I pray this week, this day, that rather being a nowhere man, asking the question, what's it all about? You may turn to that one who knows what it's all about. And rather than chasing after the wind, you may know that wind of God in your heart, that cleansing wind, when the Holy Spirit comes in and changes lives through what Jesus Christ has done for us. May God bless you. And those of you watching on YouTube, again, if you have any questions you want to post to us, we'll be happy to answer them and listen to them. I pray that this may be a time when you ask yourself the question, what's it all about? May God bless you.